were you ever knocked on your ass and feeling like your life was over, and how did you stand back up, and what did you learn from that? And almost entirely that journey from being knocked on the ground and getting back up and choosing to continue on is the baptism where leaders really become who they are.
Welcome back to Stepwise, a series of juicy conversations with inspired leaders about their insights, approaches, and journeys. My prime directives are two. First, that leadership matters to performance and people. And my second is that leading best happens with wisdom, which I believe can be understood and accelerated, including through exposure to leaders like today's guest. Will Price, fellow Bozemanite, is a father, husband, adventurer who founded and leads a venture capital firm, Next Frontier Capital, specializing in the technology sector in the U.S. Northwest. I'll introduce him more in the interview, but here's why you should listen to Will. First, he's an important and progressive thought leader in this space of authentic leadership, even carried through his own podcast called Inspired by Example. Second, his new model for leaders explains why authenticity, vulnerability, openness to learning, and intentionality and purpose are the new guideposts for leading in these troubled times. And three, he talks about the important tension and balance between humanity and accountability, which are so vital to understand and navigate. It's an important conversation with someone who's led at the highest levels and invests and develops in leaders in emerging startups. I hope you find this conversation with Will Price as valuable as I have. Will Price, thank you for being willing to sit and share ideas about leadership in this crazy world we're living in right now. I find you and your background fascinating on so many different levels. Will is the founder and CEO of Next Frontier Capital, which is a venture capital firm for tech startups in Mountain West. I think it started out in Montana, but has expanded. Will is a friend and neighbor of sorts, lives in Bozeman, Montana, married to Caroline, a wonderful human being, fantastic artist, and the father of two grown boys, Luke and Jack. Will is a pilot, outdoorsman, conservationist. Now here's where the fun starts. Beyond all that, which is fabulous, Will was born in Germany. His first 12 years of life, he lived in 8 different countries on multiple continents. Ended up in the United States for prep school, went to Occidental for your first year, I believe, and Harvard. Then ended up at business school at Kellogg, Northwestern, graduated top of your class. And incidentally, a D1 soccer player at Harvard. I love that. I had 2 daughters who were D1 athletes, and I know that all that is required in that. And so it's a really great point of admiration for me. Will worked at Morgan Stanley in their New York, Hong Kong, Singapore offices, eventually becoming a partner at the venture capital firm Hummer Winblad. And by the way, I'm going to talk about Will's podcast on leadership in a moment, but there's a wonderful one with the former CEO of Hummer Winblad I listened to yesterday. Eventually taking the helm as CEO of one of their portcos, Flight, for about 6 years. And then as I get it, Will, and you can explain this more, kind of seeking a more purpose-driven life, you and Caroline left the Bay Area for Bozeman, where you started Next Frontier Capital. And your interest is and has been in investing in mission-driven, talented entrepreneurs in Montana, mostly around tech. Now, I mentioned this before. Will is also the co-developer and co-host of a wonderful podcast on leadership, Inspired by Example. Highly, highly recommended. Co-host with his brother, Rich. It looks at central issues to leaders that have inspired them by looking at role models, turning points, values, passions, etc., which are wonderful areas of inquiry. And Will, you and I haven't talked about this, but when I'm listening, I'm only 6 interviews through so far. But common themes that I've heard, listened to from many of the leaders that have inspired you, here are some of those. There's a deep humanity of all these leaders. There's a humility, there's a curiosity. That's ones who can easily speak of their own journeys and don't shy away from deeper issues and dialogue. Again, highly recommended for anybody interested to explore and learn about their own journeys. So, how'd I do?
That was great. I love that. Thank you so much for the intro. And it's a real pleasure talked to a fellow traveler who thinks all the time about leadership, how to build great companies, how to be an authentic, present, inspiring leader. And it's stuff that I care deeply about. So.
There are many things affecting today's workforce and organizations: multi-generations in the workforce, increased need for alignment of work with purpose, quiet quitting, social justice, greater agency, incivility, divisiveness, geopolitics, etc. When you interact with and are aware of issues affecting the leaders you lead, what are the factors that are most affecting them that you're seeing? And how do you experience the impacts of those things?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think you're absolutely right. There's so many challenges today. I think the tension between high-powered organizations that are results-driven, where there's accountability, clarity, and at the same time, the need for humanity, where people can bring their whole selves to work. And often they bring more than just their job. They bring their political identity, they bring their, sexual identity, gender identities, and that's a really hard balance to strike. I would say that on top of that, you also are dealing with remote work challenges where, companies went in a distributed fashion, are now wrestling with the need to bring people back to the office. How frequently should they do that? What functions need to come back to the office? What do you do with people who don't want to come back to the office? And I think it's an arguably extremely challenging time. On top of that, you're dealing with headwinds in the economy where you've got companies that are seeing increasingly longer sales cycles, procurement, tightening belts around new vendors being approved to sell into companies. You've got interest rates that have come up and affected valuations and the flow of capital. You've had a dire lack of exits in our space, in the venture capital space, which means that LPs are pressing general partners for distributions and returns, and companies are maybe going longer than they would have expected without an exit. So you've got employees that are fully vested and thinking about whether they stick around longer, when is the exit going to happen. And you're seeing a lot of companies like Stripe, for example, just doing a bit secondary now to allow for some liquidity for the employees. So I absolutely think that it's a very hard time. And I'd say the thing that I try to do about everyone I work with is to make a couple things clear to them. The first thing is that a constructive relationship with a board member or investor requires vulnerability and intimacy. And those are kind of interesting concepts for leaders to grok over, because a lot of leaders, there's a kind of stereotypical view that they're all powerful, they're all knowing, they don't suffer setback and challenge, they're the brave face. And what I tell a lot of people is like, you got to be an authentic leader, and you got to be a learning leader. And to learn, you have to be willing to say things like, I'm not sure what to do about this, or I'm unclear about these issues, in a way that doesn't diminish your authority, but in fact invites a greater opportunity for people to coach you or to help you to sort through interesting challenges. And I'll give you an example of what I mean by this. A lot of times if you ask somebody who's going to have alpha type, how are you doing? And they'll say things like, oh, we're killing it, we're doing great. Yeah. But immediately, like, that's just a front. And when you pretend that everything's going well, you deny yourself the opportunity to learn. But if you had an opportunity where someone said, like, how are you doing? You said, look, I'm really struggling right now. I don't know how to build a high cadence, high performance sales organization, because it requires sometimes turning people over. But we have this culture in our company of being employee first and friendly and environment. So how do I hold my salespeople accountable without spooking the company, thinking that we're becoming more mercenary? Yeah. Whatever the question is, how to raise capital in an environment where capital's been turned off. Once you ask a question and you kind of expose yourself as someone who doesn't have an answer, it allows people to be like, well, I may not have unique perspective on that, or maybe I do, but let me tell you about someone who's been through that really recently, and here's how they went through it. And all of a sudden, a learning environment occurs. So to answer your question, like how I like to work with leaders, I tell them is like, I want to be the phone call you have at 6 o'clock at night or 7 o'clock at night on a Friday night. You're going home and you're really worried about something. You don't sit on that worry, because by sitting on it, your head starts spinning. You start imagining the worst outcomes possible. You go down a negative rat hole, and you're afraid to let people know that you're experiencing that, because you worry that they'll find you wanting or not tough enough or strong enough to be a leader. You have to have some people you can call and just tell them exactly how you're feeling. Like, I'm not sure I'm up to this. I'm not sure how I can overcome this challenge. And when you do that, what you realize is that all leaders go through those moments of doubt. And by expressing vulnerability, you allow for learning to occur by having other people be able to help you how they got through a similar situation. You realize that the situation you're facing is not unique in any way, and that when how bad it feels today, people always get through it, but they get through it through sharing, learning, and realizing, okay, I'm not alone. I have a group of people here who care about me and help me get through this. So I think leadership today is a combination of, you have to have certain characteristics for people who want to follow you, but you can't be so strong and so tough that you're blind to the need for input and feedback and empathy. And so being an empathetic friend, counselor, is something that I try to strive with everyone I work with.
And it strikes me, and I'll get this a little bit later too, Will, to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to admit when you don't have it all, to be open to inquire takes a fair amount of self-awareness, dare I say, I'll use the word consciousness, and confidence. So my next question is, you work with a lot of mission-driven entrepreneurs, but you're doing, I would assume, a slightly younger generation, people who may not have had all of the same turns in leadership that you have. What do you look for as you vet those deals and those leaders to, kind of pre-investment, leaving the financials aside for a moment? How do you screen leaders?
I think there's two things that we really look for. The first is this rare combination of like, all leaders need to have, I think, intentionality about what they're doing. Like they need to be driven by a sense of purpose that they've reflected on and decided, like, this is important to me. I'm not being blown on the, by the tides. I'm charting a course, and I'm asking you to come with me on that course. The second thing is kind of authenticity. They're not pretending to be someone they're not. They're comfortable in their own skin. And by that comfort, they know that they can be coachable, because someone who's comfortable and self-confident can take feedback without seeing it as a criticism or somehow demeaning your ability to lead. And so people that are, I think the number one thing I've seen in venture capital when CEOs get fired, it's not about results. It's surprisingly not about results. It's about being tenured or being able to listen to what people who care about you are telling you. And one of the things I remember learning as a young CEO who was maybe a little too cocky was, I was in a board meeting, and someone said to me after the board meeting, "I noticed you didn't take a single note in the entire board meeting." And what that signaled to everyone in that room was that I didn't really care what they had to say. I had all the answers. And so what I came to realize was that there's a moment you see often in board meetings where a board member will make a comment, a suggestion to an entrepreneur, and they'll be slightly off in the specifics of the data. They may misquote the product name, or they may not remember the VP of sales name. And the CEO will pick on that inaccuracy, attack it, and completely ignore the message that's behind it. And so what I tell people all the time is, like, listen, these are people in the room who've been through thousands of board meetings, been through lots of companies, seen success, seen failure. When they give you a comment or they give you some perspective or feedback, listen really hard for the message. It may take you 24 to 48 hours to work out what they were trying to tell you, because they may not be as articulate as you would like, or they may not frame it the exact way that's 100% factually correct, but there's a message behind it. And if you're an entrepreneur that continues to ignore those subtle comments and constructive feedback, what happens is board members start realizing, like, this person is beyond help. They are not capable of listening or hearing, and they literally shut down. They stop interacting. They stop providing the feedback and guidance. And the second that CEO misfires on results, they're gone. They get rid of them. It's letting yourself write it down. Do not rebut in the moment. Call that person up in the next 24 to 48 hours and say, I heard what you said in the board meeting. I think what you're trying to tell me is that I'm not being aggressive enough with adding new salespeople, or I'm spending too much money, or I'm ignoring a competitive threat. Whatever the comment was, I want you to know I really heard you, and I'm going to change my behavior and the company's behavior to reflect the advice you have. Now, I may not do exactly what you asked me to do, but just that active listening and confirming the feedback will make that board member feel like. And so I think that coachability, that combination of inspired sense of mission, intentionality, and direction with an ear that takes feedback and processes the feedback without a quick reaction is a key to being a good leader and someone we want to back.
I love the point too about the message may not come in the format or the style that person is comfortable with. experience with getting board feedback, it's often packaged very, very emotionally, or it is, not articulate, but the meaning and the intention is behind it. So, great point. Sit on it, but respond to it, learn from it, be open to it,
Right.
regardless of what the
Yep.
what the package looks like.
Yep, exactly.
Give me an example of when you've had a hard no, like you've met a CEO and you go, this guy's not coachable, or this lady is not coachable.
There's an arrogance, a certainty, someone who thinks that you have to act like Elon Musk or Steve Jobs, to be a tech leader, where you can tell they're just not authentic. They're playing a role like a kabuki theater. They're putting a mask on, and it's revealing a lack of confidence. And I feel like that's something I really look out for. The other thing is, often we find in highly technical leaders, there's a innate distrust of sales and marketing and go-to-market functions. There's a view that the product is so self-evidently incredible that a monkey could sell it. And so why do we need to hire these expensive people? And they're worried about their power being diluted. And so one of the things that I feel like you want to look for too is, can this person build a good team, and can they delegate to that team? So you want to, if you look at someone who's kind of dictatorial, micromanager, arrogant, not a good listener, what tends to happen is they get a lot of yes people, and anyone who's kind of has an independent position is viewed as a threat, and they kind of cut them out of the business. And so we kind of explore a lot, like, how do you see the team being constructed? Like, what skills are missing? What are your first 2 or 3 key hires? Tell me the profile of that hire. And the more that they're willing to bring in lateral senior people to surround them where their blind spots are, the more uncomfortable I get. If they say things like, well, I'm not really ready for a senior person, I think we just get a junior person in this function, a junior person in that function. It tends to be someone who maybe has a little bit more control freak in them than I realize. And someone also who's so arrogant that they think that they don't need senior, experienced, market-proven leadership around them. And once you make the investment, those people will never hire the way they need to. And they end up really sub-optimizing the possible outcome because of their inability to let go a little bit. And you have to start delegating. It doesn't mean you lose control, but you have to feel like, all right, I'm going to hire functional experts and let them teach me how to do things that I don't know how to do. And that's an important part of leadership too.
It's interesting too, listening to you talk, the calculus 15 years ago would have been a little different. We just wouldn't have been as fluent with these kinds of things. Although in hindsight, we look back and go, this stuff's obvious. Right. This is clearly obvious, but it's a lot more to the forefront of our awareness these days.
Yep.
Yeah, fascinating. As I've shared with you, my current book project is about this collision between workforce's increased needs for humanity and consideration of organizations' needs for performance and time of disruption for so many. So, and I know you're a student of this stuff. So, generally, in your opinion, what are the best leaders doing right now to cope with this tumultuous time?
Yeah, I think this is a really tough nut to crack. I would say that it reminds me a lot of what's going on in higher education, where what happened at Harvard, what happened at Penn, was that they were very quick to speak out on certain social issues. But then when other issues came to the fore, they were not quick to speak out. Like specifically George Floyd, Black Lives Matter, that was a very active part of the political scene on campus. But then when October 7th happened, as we all saw in the congressional testimony, there was a much more reluctance to say anything. And there was a double standard that was implied by that. Now, there's a famous doctrine, the University of Chicago doctrine at higher education, which basically says universities should not take positions on social issues. And you should, and so you avoid all of them. So there's an absolute, and the challenge becomes the shades of gray. Once you speak out on this issue, someone in your organization is going to say, why aren't you speaking out on this issue? It could be an environmental issue, it could be a gender issue, it could be a race issue, it could be economic equality issue. And so what I think a lot of universities are finding out the hard way is that you cannot have a voice on issues A, B, and C and be silent on E, F, and G. You need to be able, so be consistent. And designing a policy of consistency is probably best in the Chicago school of which is to say, we're not going to talk about it. It's not part of our
Right.
it's not part of our agenda. It's not our role. You all feel strongly about things. We encourage you to be active in those things. But as a administration, as a leadership, we're not going to do that. I'll give an example of that in our world today is like Frank Slootman and Mike Scarpelli at Snowflake. I remember listening to someone ask a question like, how do you deal with ESG? How do you deal with, societal issues? And it's like, we just don't do that. That's not what we're here to do. We're not believers that corporations are agents for social change. Everyone's an individual. We're here to produce results for our shareholders. And we're going to focus on that. And if people aren't comfortable in that environment, they're welcome to go work somewhere else. Coinbase came out and said the same thing. The CEO of Coinbase said, Brian came out and said, we're not a social impact organization, we're a business. And so I think what you have to think about as a leader today is, are you going to be a School of Chicago doctrine company?
Yep.
Or are you going to take positions on social issues like Salesforce and others that do? And then how are you going to handle it when there's edge cases that come out where you're not speaking out and people kind of claim that you're a hypocrite or you're not consistent and you're carrying it for the world? And so my view would be to be more like Chicago or more like Snowflake. And I understand it may make people feel like they're not being heard. But if you ask them to say, can you see the logical impact of me speaking out on this and not that? And we've seen that firsthand now with 2 presidents losing their jobs and others to come, I imagine. So I'm a big fan of Chicago. I think most universities are going to go back towards the Chicago approach, basically be like, look, we're here to educate. We're not here to be politically active. And while it may be difficult for some people to hear that story, I think it's the ultimately right thing to do because otherwise you put yourself in a logic trap that you will fail at some point and you'll be called out for being hypocritical.
In every trust index, like the Edelman Trust Index said, faith in institutions is declining. We don't believe our academic institutions anymore. We don't believe our churches anymore. We don't believe in government anymore. We're going to put more of that faith and trust in our business institutions. So Deloitte, I think 2013, before the current wave of political discourse, got a pack together and they started debating what are the things that we want to weigh in on, what are the things we don't. We are not a political organization, yet we have 173,000 people with different needs for inclusion, different needs for consideration and identities and stuff like that. And they're looking to us. So what are we going to do? What are we going to weigh in? What are we not? So they got super clear on that and they communicated well in advance about the things that they would weigh in and the areas that they would participate in. And I thought it was a wonderful example, but it is such a slippery slope. Boy, really, really hard for the typical leader or CEO. Like in the past, we would have had our comms department figure something out, put out a statement or not, but now they're looking for the CEO or somebody in the C-suite to represent that.
Absolutely.
Very hard.
And I feel like one way you could handle that would be, like charitable matching, where it's like, we'll do a 1-to-1 match on your, but like you individually have things you care about. We're going to support your interests in, volunteer days, employee hours, you can set up, if you want, take paid time off to go serve on something. But we're going to push down to the individuals what they want to do. And we're going to create a safe working environment where people are respected and not feeling marginalized and be good about that.
Boy, it's so true. It was interesting. I was at a dinner party in Bozeman, and one of our part-time neighbors lives in Santa Monica the rest of the time, very noted orthopedic surgeon. And he came in and he was complaining for the first 15, 20 minutes about this, a younger member of one of his surgical teams. And I looked at him and said, not only do you need to learn how to listen to that person because she is insanely talented, because that's why you hired her. You need to more than listen or tolerate. Embrace what she's saying. Try and find a different way to hear her. She's not trying to upset the apple cart. She's just talking about her own. Yeah. So that's really kind of one of the things that started this inquiry. Like, wow, people are bringing in their humanity, but they're doing it passionately so. And old school leaders like me, oh God, come on, toe the party line.
Right,
it's much more challenging.
I agree. I remember, reading about investment bankers in New York, analyst program, wanting to cap the hours they work and make sure they get weekends off. And, I went through that program and, if you brought that stuff up, you would have been fired immediately. So there are changes happening in the workforce, expectations. People want to have a more balance in their life early in their careers, which I think a lot of us assumed that was just the cost of what it meant to have a career. Like you get 4 days off when you're a dad, when your baby's born, and back to work the next week. Like, there's no paternity leave. Now it's 2 or 3 months paternity leave. And so there's so many things that are changing. And I do think it's probably disorienting for some of us older guys who are like, whoa, I didn't even think about that. It was just the way it was.
I know.
So.
Well, it's interesting. I don't think they're wrong.
Right.
like, did we need to do what we did? Our oldest was born on a Sunday night. I was in a 5.5-day immersive leadership program. I went to the hospital, was with my wife then. Daughter was born, and I was back the next morning at 8:30 to do whatever we needed to. They're not wrong.
No, they're not. And I think partly it's a function of it's a luxury that our society has enough wealth that's created. I mean, I think that things were tougher, things were tighter, and there was less employee power. I think there's such a demand for talent now that people are humoring employee demands, and I don't mean that in a negative way, but just acknowledging in a way that they never would have before, purely out of self-interest, because if they don't, they're not going to be able to keep the people, so.
I started off by asking you or raising the point, what does accountability look like? What does alignment look like in today's needs when, humanity's front and center? How does an organization stay aligned when so many individual needs are being brought in?
I work in the startup world where every company is on the edge of death at all times. And I don't think we have the same level of luxury to not have accountability. And so we're still very much in the results business. I've got great people that work with me, but if someone doesn't do their job or isn't focused on the right things, they'd just be asked to leave. And so I'm a really big believer in radical candor and telling people like it is. And so if you see consistent poor performance, whether it's lack of thought in work, sloppy work, just kind of being satisfied with mediocre results, there's no tolerance for that. There's this sense that this person, we have to bend over backwards to tolerate them. And what I always ask them to do in those situations is say, what about everybody else who's now having to put up with this horrible person that's incapable of doing their job, we're having to work around that person. And it is the number one way the leaders lose credibility is when they tolerate a poor performer at the cost of everyone else in the organization have to step up and protect the organization from that person's follies and foibles. I just say all the time, it's you may think you're doing someone a favor. All you're doing is alienating the rest of the work staff who are really smart and know that this person is not at the same level. I feel there's not any consistency between performance and accountability and culture, because culture sours when poor performers are tolerated.
Literally day one of business school for me, my finance professor came in and said, I had to fire a CEO today whose wife is stage 4 terminal cancer, who's got 2 kids in college. And everybody gasped, not kind of understanding where he was going with it. And he said, do you want to know why I did that? To save the families of 500 people that he was leading. Went, oh, okay, got it. So basically you have their back.
Whenever I have a difficult conversation I have to prepare myself for, I take comfort in the fact that I know I'm making a stronger organization for the people that are still going to stick around and be there. And I know that if I don't make the conversation, or have the conversation, the likelihood of our best people staying goes down, and the likelihood of our success goes down. And so, if you frame it like that, it's a no-brainer. It's super easy to do. It's easy to work for an organization, to complain about things, but when you're the leader, it's hey, I'm responsible. So if I feel like I'm complaining, what are other people doing, and step up. It just reminds me of consistency, no politics, no favorites. Everyone knows that just because I'm friends with somebody, they're not going to get a free ride, and all the results are clear. And I think one of the hardest things about a startup, startups, you always have these plans, and immediately, a month into it, 2 months into it, they're like, okay, well, we're changing our product, we're changing this. And so one of the things I think is really hard as a business leader or startup is everyone talks about OKRs and goal setting, but the more you set goals that are further out in the startup, the less likely they are to be relevant or real. And so you lose credibility sometimes too by saying, this is our goal. What I meant was, this is our goal, and you're constantly changing. And so one of the toughest things about being a startup leader is you have to have, I think, shorter term goals that you hold people accountable to, and live with ambiguity a little bit about what we're going to be doing in a year from now, without making people feel like you're rudderless or thrashing. So how do you set direction, accountability, allow for discovery and things to change?
Yep.
And so it's more about the process than the results sometimes, like defining a process of discovery, a journey of discovery, and celebrating people who are able to adapt and work quickly to that. And so I do think that sometimes that's a really fine act, to hold people accountable while being fluid and ambiguous a little bit in your direction. And that's one of the art of the startup, I think.
Correct me if I'm wrong. The people that gravitate into startups are aware by nature of that need for fluidity more than they would in going into Google or going into a more stable organization. Like, they know what they're getting into. Is that fair?
I think so. Sometimes, I mean, ultimately, sometimes I think people join startups because they think it's a path to quick money, to wealth, and so sometimes I think they don't know that. The ones that kind of survive, I think, quickly come to realize that. But I've had plenty of examples of people that are like, you know what, this is just too unstable. There's too many variables here that I don't see the answers to. And it turns out I'm much more comfortable just working at a big company. And so that's part of the process.
How do you keep a workforce aligned to mission, vision, values, purpose, goals, amidst this crazy tapestry of needs to change all the time? And in virtual workforces, in some cases, or hybrid workforces, when you don't see them and touch them all the time. How do you build a team when people aren't always in the same space? But really, that's an area of inquiry for me about keeping people aligned during times of rapid change is an important thing, but it's really, really hard to do right now.
And I definitely am a big believer in values. And I think that comes down to the leader living the values. So if you talk about being apolitical, you talk about we want to have candid conversations. It doesn't matter who has the idea. It's the best idea wins, not what political faction has the idea. If you want to talk about how you treat people and, where it could be tough love, but there's love at the heart of it, not yelling and screaming and not being a bully. And then if you just going back to the point about holding people to high standards from accountability of results, the same thing has to be true culturally too. You have to call out bad behavior. You have to say, even someone's really successful on a results basis, if they're not culturally a fit, you can't tolerate that because it really dilutes the power of the culture and people stop believing in it. So I think that's super important. The other thing I think it's really helpful is, what I think about strategy in our business is it's about what kind of risks are we willing to accept in an investment. And so like strategy is like risk acceptance criteria. So a lot of times in our firm where there'd be a challenge would be like, what's a good deal look like? Why do we pass on this deal and not this deal? Why did this die? Why did that die? And what people are constantly looking for is consistency and some kind of rationale for behavior. And if they feel like it's a black box, like things happen, but you can't understand how they happened, people start wondering like, what is happening here? Like, why did this happen and not that happen? How did that guy promoted? I don't understand. And so the confusion comes from, I think, the fact that there's not a consistent underlying logic for decisions. And so what I think you got to be clear on your culture. You got to hold people accountable to living up to those cultural values. You got to have a prescriptive definition of what success looks like. And when you make decisions, you got to be transparent in those decisions so people understand why things happen the way they do. And I feel like one thing that's changed a lot, going back to early career experience, is that we're pushing down transparency organizations at a level that never happened when I was young. Like back when I was growing up, no one really took the time to explain decisions to me. Like, this is why we decided to do this. It was just like, this is what we're doing, and there was almost a sense that like everyone's just going to be a good soldier and go along. And I think in today's world, like young people they need to know why. And it's worth taking the time to explain why things happened. And I think if you can provide that kind of candor, that transparency, that sign that there's logic underpinning the organization's decisions, they're much more likely to trust you. The other thing I try to do too is I try to do surveys of our people, and I ask them things like, do you feel like you understand your role in the organization? Do you feel like what you're being asked to do is consistent with what the strategy of the firm is? Do you understand the strategy of the firm? And just kind of do that on a periodic basis. And then even though we have a small company, you can start looking for that gap between what you think is going on and what people feel is going on. Yeah. And I'm constantly surprised how many times I feel like I've said something 100 times and people are still like, I'm not really sure about that. I don't understand. And you're like, what?
Yeah.
And I remember listening, to Jack Welch years ago talk about like his job at GE was to fly around the world and say the same three things over and over and over again, such that when he started saying them, people would start groaning because they'd heard it so many times. And I do think as a leader, you need to just reinforce the message ad nauseum.
Yep.
And even then, people still think, well, I'm not really sure what you want me to be doing. You're like, how's that even possible? But rather than to be defensive about it, be like, okay, I've got to be even more redundant in my and less. Like I've said this a couple of times to people. It's like, you may be able to multitask as an individual. Your company cannot multitask. You need consistency. Don't be the CEO that comes in every week with a new idea. I just talked to a customer. We need to change direction. We need, people don't want to be thrashed around. So even if you have those ideas, write them down on paper, maybe talk to one person, but don't start sending these big emails and get everyone upset. Be consistent and change the angle of attack slowly at a pace that the company can to digest that without feeling like they're being asked to thrash and they're unmoored from any direction.
Now I'd love to shift back to Will Price. So what's the connection for you? How did you become interested enough in leadership that you've committed, to its development through your personal learning and education of others through the podcast?
Yeah, well, I've always been a student of successful people, and I've often felt like there's certain people I alluded to earlier in this podcast that it's hard to learn from, and other people where you feel like that's someone who I can learn from. And for specifically like, the Steve Jobs biography or the Elon Musk biography, it's like, those are completely unique human beings. There's very little for me to learn from either of those people. But a lot of successful business leaders are relatable. I can say like, I can see myself in that person. So I've always been curious about that. And then I feel like some of the challenges that you have in your career are about, what's my role in the world? How do I have impact? How do I realize my potential? How do I find a setting and a place that empowers me to do my best work? Where do I get the most energy from? What kind of environments do I shy away from where I feel tired or drained from? And those were the first questions I started asking, which was like, I want to do an audit of my life. Like, what would be the place that would make the best version of me possible? And what kind of environment would allow for that to occur? And then the next logical question is, okay, well, what kind of people would create those kind of environments? And how would I learn to do that? Because I'd like to, and that led me to study leaders, because leaders create the culture, they create the environment, they recognize talent, they reward talent, they're comfortable allowing for talent to blossom and grow without kind of, feeling threatened by it. And so that led me to start asking questions of people like, who were the leaders that shaped you? What were some of the things that you learned from those leaders? Was there a pivotal moment where you made a choice in your life that changed everything? And how did you make that choice? Were you ever knocked on your ass and feeling like your life was over? And how did you stand back up? And what did you learn from that? And almost entirely, that journey from being knocked on the ground and getting back up and choosing to continue on is the baptism where leaders really become who they are. And it like success, I think is like they often said, it's like not a great teacher, because it doesn't require the introspection that failure does. Like failure requires introspection. Like, what happened? What am I going to do now about it? How do I reshape my life from this setback? And so that just led to a really, frankly, just intense set of curiosity for me that I wanted to ask people about those questions and use them to learn.
That's very cool. That's very cool. So what is inspiring your thinking and learning at present? For example, what are you reading? What are you listening to? How are you filling up or addressing that curiosity for you?
I've read a couple of good books lately. This book, The Leadership Challenge, has been a good book for me.
Oh, sure.
I really enjoyed reading this one. I feel like it's very practical. It's got a great so for people on listening, this is James Kozis and Barry Posner's Leadership Challenge. How to make extraordinary things happen in organizations. That's been a great read for me. Ron Heifetz's book, Leadership on the Line, I really enjoy. Got right here with me as well. So that's kind of my nonfiction reading. I've been reading a lot of Stoicism. So I like reading
very nice.
Meditations by Marcus Aurelius and Seneca. And I just feel like there's so much about that world, that the wisdom of those people that are informed to me. Like one of the things I thought about as a young person was I thought I'd get to this place where some of the challenges in life would kind of go away. Like life would get easier.
Sure.
And you read about Marcus Aurelius. He's like, every day I'm going to deal with people that are greedy, dishonest, and that's life. Like life is about dealing with challenge, and it's helped reframe my perspective from thinking there's a place where I'm going to get to where there's tranquility and peace and learning, and where versus realizing that every day you're going to deal with struggle and challenge, and you can choose to opt out of that life, become a monk living in a monastery. But if you want to engage in the real world where you love people, you try to do great things, you're going to deal with a lot of setback and challenge and frustration. But that's just the way it is. And like just recognizing that's part of the human condition instead of wishing for something different, accepting it, and then learning how to show up every day despite that is something that's been important to me.
Yeah, fabulous. I'm just dipping my toe in through the Ryan Holiday works, but fabulous, really great. Well, Will, you've been very generous with your time. I love this conversation. This is a blast. Very helpful.
Well, I appreciate being on. I love talking to you too, Foster. And we got to do this more often than we live in the same city.
I love this conversation, especially a couple of Will's quotes and ideas. First, I want to be the phone call on Friday evening at 6 p.m. when my CEOs are heading home, which speaks to how he sees his role in guiding and coaching and mentoring others. And second, the point he makes about why this is such a challenging time for leaders, due in part to the increase in employee power because of the very real demand for talent. Set the table, invite cool people, magic happens. I'm grateful to Will Price for sharing his wisdom with me. Until next time, leaders, step wise.
Thank you for listening to Stepwise. Stepwise is brought to you by Dr. Foster Mobley. Edited and promoted by Zetis. You can listen to more episodes wherever you stream podcasts. Find out more at fostermobleymt.com or follow us on social media at Foster Mobley. That's FOSTERMOBLEY. We look forward to having an inspiring conversation with you soon.